it's really, I want to thank everyone for coming out. I know it is another busy time of the semester. They're all busy times. This is one of them. As we finish up our courses and look towards exams, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for a talk in a series we're calling Academic Innovation in Michigan, Transforming Residential Undergraduate Education. This is a talk series that is sponsored by the Office of Academic Innovation. My name is Barry Fishman. I'm a faculty member in education and information, and I currently have the pleasure of serving as a faculty innovator in residence in the Office of Academic Innovation. The goal of this series is to challenge our thinking and help us question our assumptions about how we as an institution go about the important work of undergraduate education. I had the pleasure of collaborating with a really talented group of faculty and staff from all across the university, a number of whom are here today, thinking hard about what a new design for undergraduate education in the context of the University of Michigan, leveraging the real strengths of a major public research university, what that undergraduate program might look like. The work of today's speaker and those of others in the series are really important in helping us shape our thinking, put our work within a broader perspective, and be self-critical about both what we have done in the past and what we're thinking about doing moving forward. So stay tuned for opportunities to hear from that group about the work that we're doing and ways that we want to engage everyone on campus in that, especially in the coming winter term. And also stay tuned for future talks in this series. This is our second talk in the Transforming Residential Undergraduate Education series. Last September, many of you joined us as we welcomed folks from the Mastery Transcript Consortium to campus, who challenged us to rethink the need for grades and GPAs as part of the college admissions process, and by extension, rethink the need for grades and GPAs in everything that we do on campus. I'm seeing smiles from residential college folks. It's a long conversation with a long history and I hope a promising future. You can look forward to more talks in this series. Stay tuned also for announcements about those talks in the winter term. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome David Scobie to campus, or I think more accurately, to welcome him back to campus, which I'll explain in a moment. Throughout his career, David Scobie has worked to advance the democratic purposes of higher education, to help universities and colleges become the best version of what they can be, especially with respect to the relationships between academic work and community engagement, and the successful inclusion of non-traditional students and their success in higher education. Now, David was a member of the University of Michigan faculty from 1989 to 2005, taught American Studies and U.S. Cultural History and the history of urbanism and architecture. He is a very distinguished and productive scholar. I'm not going to go into any depth on those aspects of his scholarship in order to focus more on the work he's done in helping lead work to improve higher education. Among his lasting contributions here at the U of M was his founding of the Arts of Citizenship program, which continues to this day, fostering collaborations between the university and the community in arts, humanities, and design. I'm pleased to note that Michigan honored David both with an Excellence in Education Award and the Harold R. Johnson Diversity Service Award. Unfortunately, he left us in 2005 for Bates College as the inaugural director of the Harwood Center for Community Partnerships. And from 2010 to 2014, he served as the founding executive dean of the School for Public Engagement at the New School in New York City. You may be sensing a theme at this point in his career progression. In 2018, just this year, he assumed leadership of the Washington, D.C.-based Bringing Theory to Practice project, which is conducted in partnership with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. BTP, as they call it, coordinates a national network of innovative educators, researchers, and campuses committed to re-examining foundational values and innovative practices in undergraduate education, exactly what we're embarking on here. As I shared my interest in inviting David Scobie to come back to campus to talk with us, reactions were enthusiastically positive. I heard from many different people that they rely on your scholarship and their own work. And if I may quote anonymously from one senior member of university administration, if David Scobie is involved in something, it's worth paying attention to. So please join me in welcoming David Scobie back to campus to share his thoughts and scholarship with us today.
Thank you, Barry, for that kind introduction. Thanks to the Office of Academic Innovation for this invitation, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's weirdly strange, in a totally nice way, to be a guest lecturer here at the university, having taught here for 16 years, and having lived a mile from here for the past 3 decades. I came to the university in 1989, first as a postdoctoral fellow in the Michigan Society of Fellows, and then as a faculty member, as Barry said, teaching urban and cultural history, American studies, in history, the American Culture Program, and the Taubman College. Helped to start the Arts of Citizenship program, rode sidecar with Julie Ellison when she launched the Imagining America Consortium. Then I went to Bates College to direct that Center for Community Partnerships and the New School. The work in the New School got me passionate about the needs of adult non-traditional students as another horizon of that democracy work. And I spent 4 or 5 years doing that before starting up this work as the director of the Bringing Theory to Practice project, which is, as Barry noted, seeks to advance innovative change and institutional change that support the foundational purposes of undergraduate education. None of this actually could have happened without the University of Michigan and the inspiration and comradeship of many colleagues here, including many in this room. But I don't go over that little biography simply by way of thanks. It helps set the stage for the story I want to talk about today. It turns out that I arrived in Ann Arbor roughly contemporaneously with the start of a 3-decade period of change and crisis across higher education, which was at the same time a period of remarkable and often unremarked on creativity. I didn't understand any of this at the time. I was young and green. I'd come from a university whose elite status had protected me from the headwinds of change. And although the University of Michigan has experienced some of the stressors of these last 30 years and contributed to many of its innovations, I'd argue that it's been able to buffer, delay, and sometimes just ignore many of the challenges that have roiled the academy as a whole. Enrollment and retention shortfalls, for instance, or mass adjunctification, or deep budget cuts. For whatever reason, it took me a while to understand that the arc of my career coincided with a perfect storm of crisis, destabilizing change, and pervasive, if not always visible, innovation. Eventually, however, and I think actually going to other less secure institutions helped me here, I came to grasp this nexus of crisis, change, and creativity. And it became not just the context of my career, but one of its main subjects. As I pursued change work on civic engagement, non-traditional students, and undergraduate reform, I became a little bit obsessed with understanding the conditions within and against which I was working, understanding them both as a historian and as a would-be change agent, which will be the 2 voices that I'll be speaking to you in today. I came to think that we're living through an inflection point in American higher education, a Copernican moment, as I've called it in some of my writings, in which the changes of the last 30 years make inevitable some kind of paradigm shift over the next 30. The terms of that shift involve our educational practices, the way academic institutions are organized, the way students and faculty and staff move into them and through them, and maybe most important, the larger social compact by which higher education negotiates its justifying purposes and earns the autonomy and the resources to pursue those purposes. The end game of this Copernican moment is still up for grabs. Some of the ways forward are full of promise, others seem horrifying to me. But one way or another, staying put is not an option. This is the historical context for much of my work, for your interest in academic innovation, for the very fact that U of M has an Office of Academic Innovation. Innovation isn't simply a matter of developing the next great project, the new pedagogy, the exhilaration of turning a problem in the light, seeing it in a new way, and solving it in a new way. although all of those things are true. Innovation is also a matter right now of navigating the storm of change. My aim here, as the clunky title of my talk suggests, is to sketch the interplay of current crises and creative currents that are roiling higher ed. Although I'll draw on historical arguments I've made in writing about this Copernican moment, I'm really most interested in the ways that the terms of crisis and innovation and the ways we are talking about them have changed in recent years. At the same time, I'll have something to say about the importance of naming our foundational purposes and values, some quite traditional, some emerging and new, that can serve not as an anchor or a harbor against the storm of change, but as a guide for navigating it. Let me start with a couple of caveats. This is, by intention, a broad talk, a mile wide and an inch deep, and I'm sure it risks oversimplification. It's also, by intention, a narrow talk in that it focuses only on undergraduate education. It neglects a slew of issues, postdoctoral training, graduate and professional education, changes in research and innovations in research that are central to the mission of the University of Michigan and that are themselves also reshaped by these Copernican forces and possibilities. I'll be happy to talk with you about your thoughts about what I've left out or oversimplified. So back to my story. But enough about me. When I arrived at Ann Arbor 30 years ago, college going had already gone through a process of dramatic expansion in the post-war US. Between 1950 and 1990, post-secondary enrollments quintupled from about 2.5 million students to about 13 million. Public university and community college systems had been built. The GI Bill, which sent my father to law school, my working class father, to law school in the 1940s, the revolutionary effects of the SAT and ACT tests in the 1960s, which enabled a middle-class suburban Jew like me to gain access to an elite university, and the embattled advances of affirmative action all brought very real but imperfect democratization to higher education. I knew this, I understood the broad outlines, and as a historian here, I taught them to Michigan undergraduates. I didn't understand other transformations that this more inclusive academy was undergoing. Like most of my colleagues and most of my students, I took for granted a certain schema of the US undergraduate regime. A regime of full-time students, recently graduated from high school, taught by full-time tenure stream faculty, who guided them through a 4-year, 2-stage process where general education segued into disciplinary majors on residential campuses, segregated into academics and extracurricular campus life. In the main, this was an accurate account of the undergraduate experience at a selective institution like U of M, describing both its strengths and its weaknesses. But across American higher ed, it was coming to be importantly and increasingly wrong in almost every way. Since the mid-1990s and ever since, only 1 out of 4 US undergraduates fits the profile of a recent high schooler, financially dependent on their parental households, who attends a 2 or 4 year institution full-time. Since the mid-1990s and ever since, that same share of undergraduates, 1 in 4, is a parent. Since at least the mid-1990s, less than half of US faculty have had full-time appointments. Only 1/3 were tenure stream, declining to just over 1/4 being tenure stream in 2007. So exploitation of adjuncts, the new faculty majority, is worsening, but it's nothing new. Although graduation rates climbed at first after World War II, they flattened in the 1980s, and they continued to languish at about 40 to 50% over 6 years of enrollment. Not all the trend lines are bleak. This was an era of great pedagogical creativity, but as I'll discuss later, the high-impact practices that research has demonstrated to be most transformative for students, experiences like learning communities, first-year seminars, capstone projects, and service learning, most of which began precisely in the period we're talking about, the 1980s. These are also the practices that work around or against the ecology of atomized courses, disciplinary majors, the separation of curricular and co-curricular life. In good ways and bad, then, the official model of the undergraduate experience was breaking down. And there was growing attention to the bad news. These same years saw the rise of a robust discourse of accusation, lamentation, and critique from conservatives like Alan Bloom to radicals like Kathy Davidson, to which I'm also a proud contributor. The intellectual history of this discourse is important in its own right, but it's a story for another day. Here I want to unpack the actual crises that underlay all the bad trend lines and the Jeremiads about them. And I want to talk about three crises in particular. The first one's, of course, economic. Beginning in the 1980s and 90s, the academy has faced endemic fiscal crisis, unevenly experienced across different sectors. This was the result of a perfect storm of stressors: the growing scale and complexity of academic missions, structural increases in the costs of healthcare, energy, facilities maintenance, and IT, but most of all, the drawdown of public investment by the rightward turn in national and state politics. Since 1988, tuition in public institutions has more than tripled in real dollars. Public funding per student has declined by 12% in real terms. The value of Pell Grants has declined even more. The conservative revolution basically offloaded the fiscal crisis onto students and their families. Median loan debt tripled in the same period, and the number of students leaving school in debt increased from around 45% to 70% of all graduates. Student wage earning intensified as well, both in hours worked and the proportion of students who have to work at least 20 hours a week. For more and more undergraduates, it's not Greek life or clubs, but debt and wage earning that represent the other of their studies. Alongside these economic problems, and intensified by them, was a second crisis, what might be called the decomposition of the learning community. On the one hand, growing enrollments and stagnant budgets amplified dependence on part-time faculty, who now make up half of the faculty in public comprehensive universities and 2/3 of community college professors. On the other hand, tuition and debt pressures have pushed students, especially low-income students, to credit shop, stop out, and transfer among different institutions. As a result, we've built an academy where the majority of credits are taught by contingent faculty and the majority of students earn credits from multiple institutions. It's an increasingly unbundled academy where community, continuity, shared reflection, and sustained welcome, key conditions, I'd argue, for holistic, supportive, transformative learning, are less and less available, especially to underserved students who need it most. And it's an academy where these pedagogical benefits are inequitably distributed across sectors. It's not surprising that one key outcome has been low and inequitable levels of student success. College enrollments have burgeoned since the 1960s because of a nexus of economic and gender and family factors, the end of high-wage unionized jobs in the industry sector, the need and opportunity for women to go to college, the growing premium put on college learning and a diploma for employment in the new economy. But by contrast, completion has essentially stagnated since the 1980s, with only modest increases in the share of Americans with college degrees. And these benefits are unequally distributed. In 2010, for instance, white, black, and Latinx high school graduates entered college at nearly equal rates, an important achievement of inclusion. But whites graduated at twice the rate of African Americans and 3 times the rate of Latinx peers. Adult working and parenting students are 3 times more likely to stop out than traditional undergraduates. Class disparities are even larger. Among current 24-year-olds in the US, those whose families come from the top quartile of income, 77% hold bachelor's degrees. For the children from the bottom quartile, that figure is 9%. We've been living with a gaping divide between access and success, especially the success of underserved students, which means that there's been an expansion of those with some college no degrees, as the demographers call it. They tell us that nearly 40 million Americans, about 1 in 4 to 5 of all adults, depending on the state you live in, have begun college and then stopped out. I've written elsewhere about the economic, social, and emotional costs of this systemic failure on the part of higher education and the extraordinary intentionality with which many adults return to school, notwithstanding the complexity of their lives and the barriers of engaging an academy designed for someone else. These students constitute that non-traditional majority that I mentioned before, the Iraq War vet, the 22-year-old barista or construction worker, the parent with a part-time job. Now, I began this look backward in the talk by noting the real but imperfect democratization of educational opportunity, and that's true. But it's truer to say that these changes have all at once democratized, delayed, and disorganized college going in the US. There's a tangle of incentives, barriers, and pressures. Economic changes that expanded the need and benefits for college, social changes in family structures and gender relations, a growing commitment to multiracial access, and yet an ascendant politics that undercut public support for higher education. It's been hard for educators to grasp this complex totality. We experience their effects piecemeal in departmental budget fights over budget cuts, fights over affirmative action, the growing number of our students working too many hours for wages. But it's even harder for students and their families to understand them. They simply experience college going as more essential, more expensive, more difficult to navigate and accomplish. And that points to the third dimension of crisis that I want to describe, the crisis of legitimacy. The growing sense that as the normative model of undergraduate education is broken down, as graduation rates have declined and debt and tuition levels have ballooned, the academy has betrayed its commitments to the larger society. As I said earlier, there's always been a kind of social compact that negotiates the purposes of higher ed and negotiates our access to resources and autonomy to pursue those purposes. It's not surprising that precisely during this Copernican era, that compact has grown frayed. The battles have evolved from Bush-era culture wars that dominated the national conversation when I first came to Ann Arbor, to the legal struggles over affirmative action, where U of M played so central a role, to student and public revolt over debt levels, to growing skepticism about the value proposition, the ROI, the return on investment of a college degree, to current state-level efforts to defund liberal arts majors at public universities. Since 2006, higher education has itself become a lightning rod for regional, racial, class, and political polarization. What began 30 years ago as public mistrust at the arrogance of the academy, mistrust with which I had a lot of sympathy, has now corroded into an existential threat. So what do we do about all these crises? How do we navigate this storm? The first thing to remember is that crisis is not the only theme of these 3 decades. It's way too bleak and one-sided an account. The same years witnessed remarkable creativity in innovation, partly made possible by the openings wrought by change and crisis, partly in response to these crises. You may think here I'm referring to the brave new world of digital tools and pedagogies, the world of MOOCs, online degrees, flipped classrooms, and Canvas, and I'll discuss those later. But those were actually latecomers in this era of innovation. First came a whole slew of non-digital innovations that helped to reshape undergraduate education. The weakening of the curricular hegemony of the disciplines, for instance, led to a flowering of new interdisciplinarities: cultural studies, media studies, neuropsychology, community health, gender and ethnic and queer studies, in many cases, as these last examples show, driven by student and young faculty activism in a newly diverse and democratized academy. Equally important was the emergence of what the scholar George Q has called high-impact practices. Among them, first-year writing seminars, learning in living learning communities, undergraduate research, internships and experiential learning, capstone and signature projects, study abroad, community-based learning and civic engagement, where I cut my teeth on these issues. Nearly all of these practices were created or scaled up exactly in the 1980s and 90s. The way they evolved and spread was movement-like and insurgent. Communities and change makers came together in associational and collaborative networks, Campus Compact, Imagining America, many others, through which experimental practices were developed, tested, critiqued, and improved. They all worked across and against the ecology of departmental majors, the segregation of curriculum and co-curriculum, the boundary between campus and community, the temporality of the semester. Innovation, in other words, emerged from the fissures of the old paradigm. Because these innovations were geographically distributed and often disconnected from each other on campuses, it's hard to grasp how consequential they've been for the improvement of undergraduate education. When I came to Michigan in 1989, both UROP and the Program of Intergroup Relations were 1 year old. Now they are national exemplars of undergraduate research and multicultural learning. Campus Compact was 4 years old. Imagining America was a decade away. Now they are among the key leaders in a national movement for democratically engaged education that can seem established and even old hat and vanilla. In 2009, my oldest son graduated from college. If he were asked to name his most transformative experience, his list would include a first-year seminar that did community-based research on homeless shelters in Philadelphia, an internship at a West Philly councilman's office, a semester at the University of Cape Town, a junior seminar where the final assignment was a paper on justice to be written with graphic novel software, and a capstone thesis for urban studies on representations of the urban crisis in The Wire. Literally none of these experiences were available to me when I was an undergraduate. I believe that these creative innovations of the past 30 years hold important lessons for the next 30. To return to my Copernican metaphor, they're like the anomalous points of light in the night sky that led the Polish astronomer to reject the exhausted Ptolemaic cosmology and develop the heliocentric model. These practices offer glimmers of a next-gen paradigm, one that melds a commitment to core educational values, the whole student integrative learning, education for the public good, with a willingness to redesign learning experiences and learning communities. Now, I'm mindful that this idea, the idea that the innovations of these last 30 years can solve the crises of these last 30 years, that this is a hard sell. It's counterintuitive for two linked reasons. First of all, there's a kind of asymmetry between the bad news I've been describing and the good news. My account of crisis was all about large structural forces, demographic change, economic reorganization, political disinvestment, and the systemic failures of higher ed to deal with them. The story of creative innovation was more modest in scale. On-the-ground networks, medium-sized consortia, programmatic experiments, personal anecdotes. It's easy to see how fiscal crisis, stop-out rates, and culture wars can undermine queer studies programs and community partnership centers. It's harder to see how these kinds of innovations might catalyze the reshaping and securing of new kinds of academic institutions. Secondly, stakeholders inside and outside higher ed have already begun to respond in new ways to these issues. Particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, the national conversation about higher education has moved on. The negotiation over the academic social compact has changed. A wave of new innovations, including digital innovations, has taken shape and taken root in the academy. These evolving debates and initiatives have their own pathways for change in higher education. More than ever, it's urgent to discern which of those paths are generative and which are destructive. It's clear that the Copernican story needs a reboot. Now, it's beyond me to offer you a crisp and complete analysis of recent trends and the implications they hold for the future of higher ed. But I want to note 5 important responses by educators, policymakers, and educational thought leaders. 5 new ways that they are trying to navigate, debate, and shape change for better and for worse. The first of these new changes is the completion agenda, the nationwide push to raise attainment rates in reaction to the stagnant outcomes that I've described. The Obama administration and the 30-state coalition Complete College America helped to drive this push, but its leading advocate is the Lumina Foundation, which has spent tens of millions of dollars on its Goal 2025, a plan to raise the proportion of Americans with post-secondary credentials to 60% by the year 2025. This push reflects a mix of concerns about the harm of low educational attainment to American economic competitiveness, about class and racial disparities in educational success, about the unequal access to the civic, family, social, and health benefits that come with actually completing college. The completion agenda has in turn catalyzed 2 more of these new responses. One is a broad effort by academic institutions to improve retention and attainment for underserved students, students of color, first-gen students, low-income students, immigrants, dreamers, and others, all of whom often face marginalization on campus. In support of student success, colleges and universities, especially public institutions, have been remarkably innovative. Schools like Georgia State, Wayne State, and CUNY have launched a wide range of novel mentoring, peer community building, and wraparound so-called concierge services. A coalition of land grants is experimenting with the use of data analytics and retention grants to boost completion. A wide range of community college systems are implementing what are called guided pathways curricula designed to keep students on track and on time. And at the same time, educators, policymakers, and completion advocates are beginning to focus for the first time on adult non-traditional students, the third of these new trends. Sometimes this adult turn reflects a marketing strategy for increasing enrollments after the Great Recession. Sometimes it's a policy imperative to increase the numbers of graduates. But it's often an authentic response to the imperative, to the invisibility of non-traditional students. 6 years ago, when I began working with and writing about adult learners, it was hard to get any 4-year institution to pay attention to their lives, needs, and aspirations. Now nearly every non-selective university is competing for the adult market, often in partnership with nonprofit intermediaries or profit-making intermediaries. And at the same time, a new group of aggressively innovative online providers, Arizona State University, Western Governors University, Southern New Hampshire's College for America, have all launched mass baccalaureate completion programs with nationwide online enrollments in the tens of thousands. The growth of online is in fact the fourth of these new responses. 1/3 of all US undergraduates now take at least one online course during their studies. 1 out of 7 are enrolled in fully online programs. Equally important, the past decade has seen the development of a wide range of digital practices for teaching and learning and digital tools for managing the college experience. Flipped classrooms, MOOCs, e-portfolios, learning management systems, data analytics applications, and of course the use of Google and Wikipedia for student research. We tend to think of this digitally mediated education primarily in terms of online courses, primarily as a means of delocalizing and mass customizing the curriculum. But its possibilities are remarkably multivalent. It enables new forms of project-based collaboration, multimedia teaching, synchronous and asynchronous communities, the efficient presentation of preparatory materials in flipped curricula in classrooms. I think we're only beginning to figure out the implications, both positive and negative, of digital tools for higher education. The last of these 5 trends isn't about the who or the how of higher education, but about the what and the why. It's the growing dominance of what I'll call instrumental vocationalism in debates about the justifying purposes of higher ed. To be sure, the benefits of college for career, upward mobility, and economic security have long been central to students, their families, tuition payers, public funders, and the discussion of the academic social compact. But I can't remember any time in my career, even at the height of the Reagan Revolution, where the ROI of college for employment has so dominated the national conversation. Even equity-minded thought leaders like the Lumina Foundation's Jamie Mirasotis or Barack Obama tend to construe the public good of higher ed almost solely in terms of its capacity to endow students with skills and credentials for the labor market. All 5 of these trends were catalyzed in one way or another by the crises and changes of these 30 years that I've been describing. All of them are truly innovative, and many of the ideas, practices, and tools are valuable. The completion agenda, for instance, is a welcome challenge to an academy that for too long limited its equity concerns to expanding the access of underserved students and then neglecting their success. The student success practices that academic institutions have developed, summer bridges, retention grants, food pantries, and the like, are proving effective in lifting inclusion and success for underserved students. Adult-serving programs like College Unbound and the Evergreen State College use community-building rituals and high-impact practices designed specifically for the lives of working adults to graduate about 80% of their students. Online degree programs have shown themselves effective options for distance learners and self-starters who don't require or can't get to face-to-face relations with faculty, mentors, and peers. Even the influence of vocationalist discourse has had a beneficial effect on the mainstream academy, pushing liberal educators to take seriously the work anxieties and aspirations of our students and to develop internships, experiential learning opportunities, and skill-building boot camps that can help. But these new trends are all profoundly equivocal. Unlike the high-impact innovations of the 1980s and 90s, which treated student learning as holistic, integrative, public-facing, and emancipatory, these innovations are often implemented in ways that instrumentalize students, unbundle different aspects of their lives, and subordinate their aspirations and choices to the efficiencies of employers, the government, and academic institutions. Thus, completion advocates like the Lumina Foundation quickly devolve into credentialism, toting up the numbers of graduates rather than focusing on improving teaching and learning practices, treating completion as itself the goal of good education rather than its benchmark. Student success advocates embrace intrusive advising and the use of data analytics and digital monitoring, not just of assignments completed or grades, but of granular behavior like library visits and CMS logins to nudge students toward programs for which they are deemed likelier to succeed. In the name of success metrics, they risk reproducing the social inequities of college readiness that they're trying to undo. The adult turn too often presumes that all adults want is accelerated job training, a presumption that's refuted by survey data and research, including mine, that demonstrates the complexity of adult students' motivations. Online education is, for me, the most complex and extreme case of these contradictory effects. It opens up a wide range of creative capacities for teaching, learning, and community building in education. Capacities to collaborate, for multimedia assemblage, for game and virtual reality-based learning, for seamless communication among teachers and peers, for overcoming barriers of distance, disability, and the implicit biases and power imbalances that often come in the classroom. But the dominant modes of online coursework too often reinforce the isolationism of the individual student, the atomization of assignments and learning experiences, and transactional relationships between teachers and transactional relationships with teachers and coaches. It's almost as if the brightness of the light of digital innovation has made it hard to see and remember everything we've learned about earlier high-impact innovations. This may be why, except for self-starters who really thrive in the digital environment, online courses, degrees, and MOOCs report lower levels of academic performance, student engagement, and completion than hybrid or on-site courses. But the most concerning example for me of the destructive implications of these new trends has to do with instrumental vocationalism, with the reduction of education to preparation for work and the reduction of the preparation for work to skills-based job training. This has diminished the national conversation about the aims of higher ed, crowding out all other purposes and even thinning out the meaning of work itself for students' own development and civic life. And this is not just a matter of policy and press palaver. The discourse of instrumental vocationalism shapes family decisions about where and what students will study, institutional decisions about campus mission and programmatic support, and policy decisions about budget allocations and financial aid. It's the terrain on which the academic social compact is now being rewritten with potentially disastrous results. I started this talk by noting that the past 30 years have seen tumultuous change in higher education. An older regime of undergraduate education lost its authority in the face of new conditions and crises. The emergence of new paradigms was still up for grabs. There were, I argued, both promising and perilous paths forward, depending on the choices that stakeholders inside and outside the academies make. Now I'll add something new. The trends of the past few years have thrown that choice into starker relief. Many academics understandably want to resist and defend their work against the undermining consequences of the changes I've been describing, against fiscal stringency, the sometimes anti-intellectualism of these changes, bureaucratic encroachments on traditions of faculty autonomy. But digging in our heels is a mistake. Change is coming one way or another, and if we don't take part in negotiating it, it will simply happen to us. Conversely, some educators, faculty, staff, and administrators celebrate innovation as such, embracing or at least engaging every experiment or disruptive practice with relish. That too seems to me a mistake. As I've tried to sketch, the implications of these waves of innovation, the possibilities they open up, are profoundly contradictory. What the academy faces is not a choice between innovation and the status quo, but one between alternative futures. And to oversimplify a bit, it is becoming a choice about an increasingly dominant paradigm that instrumentalizes both learning and students, a paradigm that privileges credentials and job training as the value proposition of college, as our key benchmark of institutional success and even equity. The most powerful forces and agents of change in the current moment are driving the academy, especially the non-elite academy, toward that destination. But we're not there yet. Contesting this instrumental model will require critique and creativity at many levels. It means making the case in the national conversation, the world of Atlantic essays and Lumina Foundation reports and policy briefs and state legislative debates, for a more holistic, integrative, engaged model of education, one that is emancipatory for students, transformative for communities, and even dynamic for the economy. It means pursuing research that demonstrates the effects of a holistic student-centered practices on completion, academic engagement, and post-graduation outcomes. It means reclaiming the completion agenda and the student success movement. But most of all, the pursuit of positive change requires a project of educational redesign. The redesign of both the undergraduate experience as a whole and of institutions that support it. And here I'd argue the story of creative innovation that I've described, most of all the story of high-impact practices, suggests a way forward. What is it that makes these practices? To remind you, first-year seminars, learning communities, internships, community-based learning, study abroad, undergraduate research, capstone programs. What is it that makes these such powerful countermodels for educational change? I'd argue that it's their mixing of significant, even radical design experimentation with their loyalty to a grounded vision of the guiding purposes of undergraduate education. On the one hand, the development of these practices was animated by faculty, staff, and students disrespecting the boundaries and hierarchies of the old regime, the divisions among departments, the division between campus and the larger world, between term time and off time, between curricular and co-curricular domains of student life. And on the other hand, these practices were animated by a theory of the purposes of college, often tacitly embodied in practical program design, but sophisticated and deep. That theory of education drew on the classic themes of the liberal arts tradition, the importance of inquiry-based learning, the development of the whole person, the nurturing of cosmopolitanism and empathy, of civic engagement and social responsibility. But it integrated these values with a less traditional, more Deweyan emphasis on active, experiential, and project-based learning. It defined the atom of education not as the semester course or the departmental major, but as learning experiences that occurred across a variety of settings, scales, and temporalities. And finally, to stress a point that's often missed in laundry list presentations of these practices, taken together, they frame education as a developmental process that is at once shared and continuous, collective and individuating, an arc of experiences from first-year seminars through transformative explorations to capstone projects. All in all, it's a remarkably complete and nuanced theory, although one that's distributed in a constellation of smaller, seemingly disconnected innovations. I don't mean to argue that high-impact practices are sitting there like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle waiting to be aggregated into a next-gen paradigm. I'm suggesting that that paradigm should draw on and draw out the combination of foundational purposes and creative daring that these innovations embody in piecemeal fashion. What would a sketch of purposes and interventions look like as a next-gen paradigm? On the one hand, I'd argue for a vision of the undergraduate career as an arc of experiences that is active, collaborative, and integrative, weaving together intellectual, civic, personal, and professional growth. Its curriculum would be not simply interdisciplinary, but truly holistic and problem-based, leading to both experiential learning in community and work settings and to experiences of knowledge-making and open-ended problem-solving. It would offer students close relationships with teachers, mentors, peers, and community-based significant others. At the same time, it would offer the opportunity and resources for self-authoring. It would offer, and in fact, it would require that students curate and narrate their own experiences, where they've worked and where they haven't. On the other hand, this nexus of purposes and goals requires a radical redesign of the traditional structural elements and social roles of undergraduate education. To name only a few of the design challenges, it implies an expansive reconception of faculty roles to be much more holistic and relational, rather than simply that of subject matter expert and research guide. It implies deeper integration between faculty and a range of non-faculty colleagues, those involved with community engagement, student life, career guidance, and instructional design. Perhaps most challenging of all, it implies the deconstruction and redesign of the academic calendar and the credit hour economy. Just as the classroom would no longer serve as the dominant spatial atom in a complex landscape of learning experiences, the semester course and the credit hour would no longer be the dominant temporal unit of teaching and learning. A more flexible calendar would include a weave of long-form projects taking a year or more, short-form intensives for skill acquisition, and periodic times for reflection, stock-taking, curation, and planning. Now, you may utterly disagree with the sketch I've just given. It's meant as the beginning of a conversation. These disagreements are exactly what we ought to be debating and distilling. My larger point is about our change. Our larger point is about our change work, our design project, and the way it has to meld experimental daring with an ongoing iterative conversation, both ethical and epistemological, about our purposes, the purposes of education, a conversation in which all teachers and staff and students have to take part. Innovation has become a word to conjure with in higher education. You're embracing it here at U of M. I do too. But especially in an era of turmoil and change, when innovation is all at once necessary, possible, and dangerous, it requires the mindful naming of guiding purposes. The discernment of these purposes is as important to radical innovation as any makerspace design lab or skunkworks. To flog my nautical metaphor one final time, guiding purposes don't offer shelter from the storm, but they do offer a rudder, a compass, and ballast for navigating it. Thanks. So we
Certainly have time for questions.
have at it. We have at least a half hour. And I'd love to hear thoughts, questions, challenges, worries.
If I may, I'm faculty in engineering. One of the challenges I see is that the area under the curve of the things that we have to teach have exploded in the last 20 years. So what do I call first principles anymore? That's the tough part.
So let me, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear your opinion.
It'd be helpful for you to repeat the.
Our colleague is in the engineering school and noted that the curricular requirements of what need to be taught and what students need to learn has exploded over the same period in engineering and crowded out lots of other possibilities, if I'm understanding you right. How do we think about that in light of what I'm talking about? So the first thing I want to say is that even though I come out of the humanities as a historian, every claim I'm making, both the historical claims and the kind of normative ones about where we should go, are not an argument for liberal arts education. The guiding purposes that we want to distill are as alive and important in the nursing school and the engineering school as they are for history majors or fine arts and studio majors. In all of those places, maybe most of all in engineering, there's a tension and a trade-off between content-based knowledge and skills transfer and what we could broadly call education for the 21st century skills that I've been stressing, open-ended problem solving, collaboration, creativity, and that tension is real. In my world of humanities teaching, I believe that we way overemphasize the range of knowledge transfer that needs to happen, as opposed to learning how to think, to research, to work together, to apply historical knowledge to the contemporary world, and to give students the opportunity to absorb new content and skills acquisition as needed for the projects of their life. I'm mindful that the hardest case of that trade-off may be the engineering school. I'm not minimizing that, but I think, and at the same time, I know of programs, I'm thinking of, if this still exists, the GEMS program at the University of Maryland, College Park, that created a 4-year curriculum that massaged many of these values into the technical engineering curriculum. So I guess my key response is, don't take as a given and a fact of nature that everything that is in a crowded curriculum needs to be taught. Revisit that in light of these guiding purposes.
If I can follow on that, I'm from the medical school. We've got at least that much problem. And so from the medical school's perspective, same way overcrowded curriculum, and we have taken the bull by the horns to really do the analysis of what you described. Just because we've taught it for 150 years doesn't mean it's still relevant. Also recognizing, even though you focused on undergraduate education, that the education doesn't end even at the 4th year of graduation. And I think a growing recognition, certainly in the professional schools, that part of our responsibility is building in the skills and the attitudes, proclivities for continuing education and knowing how to do that well.
Just very quickly, has the medical academy developed some good models for reshaping that balance between content knowledge and emerging themes and skills?
Well, every medical school is unique, and they're all taking different approaches towards trying to decide what they can still include. Medicine has a major emphasis on competency-based education now. So there's a much greater emphasis on not what we've taught, but what you need to be able to do, and reforming curricula to direct towards those goals. It smacks a little bit of your instrumental vocationalism, because it's very pragmatic in that sense. But I think there's also a growing recognition that it's not just skills and knowledge, but it is the attitudes, the philosophy, the ethos of being a physician as well. So there's a recognition of the broader.
Thanks. So a couple thoughts in response. One is, I want to be clear that my critique was of instrumental vocationalism, not of professional education. I actually think we have great models of integrative, holistic, experiential but reflective professional education that students enter precisely because they know the career path they want to be on. The second point I want to make, and I'll be interested in the responses of some of our colleagues from the Office of Academic Innovation, because I think they may disagree with that, is I put a big stake in the ground for the importance in undergraduate education, whether old adult learners or traditional post-high schools or whatever, for integrative, holistic communities of practice that attend to and recognize the whole person and enable them to kind of author their lives, even if their moment of life, post-adolescent identity formation, is not what's on the table. It seems to me that it's the gift of the undergraduate experience to make available that vision of active, engaged, holistic education in whole continuous communities of learning against the pressures of unbundling and fragmentation that are happening. To me, that means, although I really like the project of lifelong learning, it's not enough to say undergraduate experience just begins a process of lifelong learning. There's a particular kind of social transformation that happens, and that doesn't rely on elite institutions. I've seen it in very small adult-serving urban programs as well. And so I tend to be worried about granularized, modular, disaggregated educational experiences. I'm very skeptical that stacking those different experiences is educationally valuable for students until they've had this foundation to build on. I'm going to move over here.
I'm Lori Shearhart. I'm a librarian here. Thanks for your talk. I've been reflecting on my own education and how I responded personally to some of the features that we're discussing as the best features of the education that we can offer. And I'm thinking a little about cohort, how the importance of cohort and the importance of timeline, especially in undergraduate education. I personally took 5.5 years to get my undergraduate degree and 3.5 years to get my master's degree, mostly because I was working a lot, and just doing it little by little. And I missed a lot of the opportunities for residential experience and residential communities and other travel and experiential learning because of that. Learned other things and built up other communities, but how do we provide some of these exceptional features of a world-class education to students of the future who more and more are not able to be here all together at the same time?
So I would argue that as part of that official regime that I had in my mind in 1989 was the embeddedness of these educational values in the residential campus, and also in a particular developmental moment of the post-high schooler. I've now seen lots of really wonderful institutions and programs and spaces that do a really good job of honoring, recognizing, transforming the whole learner for people who are living the life that you led, people who can't afford to be at a residential campus. To give you just one anecdote, the Tacoma program at the Evergreen State College, which is an urban satellite program that for adults that was launched by an African American faculty member in the black neighborhood in Tacoma, the Hilltop neighborhood. Everyone there is working, like 80% are Pell eligible, more than half are students of color, the average age is in the 30s. They graduate 80 to 90% of their people, of their students on time, and they do it by anchoring a weekly 3-hour meeting of the whole 100, there are 200 student cohorts, it's a small program, in which everyone comes. There are really important rituals of community building and support, and in those 3 hours they also break up into course seminars, and there's a range of curricular things that happen. That's the only time they get together. But it is an extraordinary and transformative experience, partly because the students' sense of peer commitment to each other, their refusal to let one another fail, and all of them confront really deep challenges in their lives, helps to produce a lot of the kind of felt experiences that we associate with being able to be on campus in a residential dorm. So very different lives, but I would argue there are opportunities to design for enabling these experiences without being able, for people who can't live the life of the 4-year residential campus.
Hello. To put some context to this question, I'm a non-traditional student here at the university, and I love the phrase that you said, the holistic engagement of education. First time I've actually been able to articulate why I wanted to come here to this university. So my question would be, how can elite universities such as the University of Michigan help to attract more non-traditional students? And then a follow-up question would be, as you mentioned in your talk, that the economic reasons for going to college are very prevalent today, and especially with non-traditional students. I remember when I was going to school and I was working full-time and going part-time, so many times my colleagues would ask me, well, what are you going to school for? And I would tell them, I don't know. I just love to learn. And so how can universities like Michigan, who provide that liberal arts education, that space for mostly traditional students to find themselves, to learn, to really be entrenched in academia, how can they provide that for non-traditional students who really can't provide the time necessary for them to achieve that?
I think there's a complicated set of changes that are needed to support this kind of great education, particularly for older working parenting students at an elite selective university like U of M. And I'm not sure many of those elite universities are up to those changes, but they would involve redesigning student support, not just services, but community building and peer cohort experiences. They really take going through the same process of faculty and staff education and socialization that I think U of M, for instance, has done really well in engaging its own commitment to multiculturalism. Was giving a talk about adult students to faculty at another university near here and said about, adult students, the car breaks down and they can't afford to fix it. Their kid gets the flu and they miss a week or two and the whole semester's shot. And I said, faculty need to understand how to solve that problem. And a math professor in the audience says, we just can't do that. The curriculum is based week by week on building, and that's actually more than a random anecdote, because math is the shoal on which non-traditional and underserved students founder. But that's a perfect example of the problem that has to be solved, by saying, failure is not an option here. We need to. It takes a whole set of practices and socialization and support. That's easier to do in non-selective institutions because faculty have more everyday experience with what these lives and needs and aspirations of these students are. One and then the other.
Westboro School of Kinesiology, you've mentioned a couple of times curricular and co-curricular activities and integrated learning communities. So we know that extracurricular activities are often a really transformative part of a student's experience. So are you imagining extracurriculars getting pulled into the curriculum, or how are you seeing in the future those working together?
Well, I'm not imagining any particular tactical design, like, whether leadership of a club should give you academic credit. I think different settings and institutions solve those problems in ways that are appropriate to them. Living learning communities at Michigan, at U of M, are a perfect example of an experience that totally embeds co-curricular and extracurricular activities in the kind of student community structure and the curricular structure. But so are study abroad experiences, as I know from, in some ways, the community building and extracurricular experiences that, my son who went to Cape Town would tell you that the classes at UCT were awful, but the experience was transformative in both intellectual and social and political and community ways. So when I gave those very brief comments at the end about the deepest design challenges for a new paradigm, the point about the faculty role is that, and which had a double message, that faculty need to think of the role in a more holistic way and need to build educator communities of practice with staff so that they recognize emotional and mental health stress, so that career mentors are working with faculty, so that all of them see the whole range of a student's life, extracurricular, athletics, co-curricular, student activism work. It's easier to do for obvious reasons in a compact residential campus, easiest to do in a liberal arts college. We need to design for being able to extend that into different spaces and temporalities. You had your...
Hi, Diana Burbidge, also a librarian. Thank you for your talk. I just sort of piggybacking on something that you said in response to Melissa. Talk about adjunct faculty and how many more we have as a percentage in these last 20 years, and how many more adjunct students we have, part-time students.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how you just mentioned sort of the tentacles and the connections and the empathy and the care, and how those are converging concepts, adjunct faculty and an adjunct student. And do you have any examples of really strong bond building there?
So I think the first thing I would do is, first of all, to say the new faculty majority, the kind of mass turn to adjunct, is a huge problem and deeply exploitive to part-time faculty. And although I think the future of higher education will not be in preserving the current tenure system, but could be in a systemic commitment to full-time contract faculty with access to research and promotion. And for me personally, that would not be a bad outcome, given all of these problems and stressors. An academy based on the labor of part-time faculty is a terrible outcome. That being said, I would disaggregate the experience on both the faculty and the student side. I was the dean of a college at the new school with 100 full-time faculty, both tenure stream and not, and 600 part-time faculty. And it had programs in urban studies, international affairs, media studies, interesting interdisciplinary programs. In those situations, a certain kind of part-time faculty member, practitioner experts who do more than skill transfer, they help model the kind of life the students are leading, are really valuable. But that's a minority fraction of part-time faculty. So I would be working for full-timization and faculty. Faculty community is as important as student community in this. With currently among enrolled undergraduates, 45% of them attend part-time. The large majority of those part-timers in community colleges. Sometimes their life experiences make that absolutely necessary, and we want to design for opportunities for connection and community, both learning cohort connections, but also a larger sense of community. And some comprehensive universities and community colleges have done that well, and we can learn from them. But that's much too high a percentage, and it has to do with these larger economic stressors and lack of support for education. The last thing I'd say is when you ask the question in terms of successful completion rather than happy and rich educational experience, it's pretty clear that continuity is the really important issue for students even who don't have the money or the time to attend full-time. Staying in school even part-time, keeping those relationships and connections is really key. That's one of the reasons why I'm dubious about multiple institutions and stackable credentials. James?
Yeah, so I got a rise to the bait that you dangled out there 10 minutes ago.
Go for it.
So if I were going to characterize the bait, it was you said you think maybe the folks in academic innovation here are sort of more focused on unbundling and lifelong learning, and you're really interested in how we preserve and make sure we continue to innovate in the transformative experience that undergraduate education provides.
Just to be clear, I wasn't assuming that you were arguing for unbundling, but that you were more tolerant and less concerned about it than I.
That's fine. I'm ready for the credit hour economy to blow up. If we unbundle it along the way and rebundle it, that's it. But I think that's the important thing, right? I don't think anybody in the academic innovation enterprise at Michigan is interested in anything less than how we pursue transformative, life-changing experiences. I think where we might put more emphasis is on trying to find ways to diversify the experience, provide more opportunities. So when you cited, I believe it was the Portland school, right? That is a rebundling of a very different experience. So I think what we are embracing is there's an opportunity. Unbundling is often heard as unraveling, and it's experienced as loss. And what we look at is the opportunity to use data and experiments and unbundling to find new bundles that reach a more diverse set of students than we currently do, and to do that in a way that maybe starts to address scale. Because one of the concerns that I always have is most of the talks that talk about
how are we going to preserve that transformative experience, don't deal with the financial side as well, right? It's great in a well-resourced university to provide all kinds of rich learning experiences. How do we think about new ways to do that?
So let me, thank you, James. Three quick responses. First, some context. James and I are having a conversation about a term of art, unbundling education and rebundling, and that's about forces, whether seen positively or negatively, that are disaggregating educational experiences. And the term rebundling has been used by a colleague and friend of ours in this game, Randy Bass, who co-wrote a really interesting report called Open and Integrative about the need to kind of, through a sort of jujitsu, and I hear James saying something similar, use the forces of change to find new constellations and bundling it. I totally agree with that. And while I utterly trust that that's the mission of the Office of Academic Innovation, there are many other folks who see the disaggregation and modularization and kind of Amazon shopping cart structure of education as precisely the right thing. And them, I'm going to put my stake in the ground against. The last thing I want to say is about the question of scale that you brought up, James. So some of the examples that I gave, like the Tacoma program, I think is what you were referring to, or College Unbound in Providence, which are small-scale programs with tuitions, with annual tuition of under $10,000. In other words, a Pell Grant pays the majority of them. They're not good for certain kinds of technical education. You can't get an engineering degree in them. But they deal with this issue of scale and expense differently. And it seems to me we haven't thought enough about the creation of smaller scale networked resource sharing educational spaces that preserve the opportunities for the values that I was lifting up, but are deeply innovative and solve the kind of question of expense in different ways. And one of my own metaphors for that is the old Carnegie libraries. Andrew Carnegie, distributed small-scale institutions. He scaled out across the American landscape, and the goal was not for them to become large urban libraries, but they were a very efficient way of distributing access to libraries. That's just an image and a metaphor to think with, but we too often think about scaling as scaling up towards giantism, which is sometimes an economy of scale the right solution. But scaling out and networked collaboration can also be important.
You'll join me again.
I think one more question.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Devin. I work at the School of Information, specifically work with Barry, and I work around transfer student initiatives. I'm new to this work, and I just am thinking about the examples you use where there's been this huge push in innovation and change over time, where we had critical mass, right? So with the GI Bill, we had huge masses of people from sort of lower and middle income coming into the schools, and so places like Harvard. So there's this need, this urgency of changing and shifting. I'm in the higher ed program now, and I'm looking at IPEDS data, and we do not have that here, right? It's like 2% of students are under 25 and older, and 4% African American, 6% Latinx. So you don't have that same critical mass. The examples used in Tacoma, same thing. We have critical mass. We're talking about a group of people that are sort of from the same place, experiencing similar information. So you're able to create these programs, and I really see at University of Michigan, we're trying to serve two masters. Right? We're trying to create this increased access, and so we're inviting people to come to campus, and then they're here, but we're also trying to maintain this elite status, which means like yes, but not always, or yes, but. There's a lot of yes, but going on. we should let these end, but then they have to have, 3.5 GPA or above, even though we're doing holistic review. So, when the rubber hits the road, you see this tension going on, and, why should a professor figure out how to modify their curriculum if like 90% of students in their class don't need it, come in? So I guess it's a question, it's just bringing this up and thinking, how do we create those spaces? Like we love to have a transfer student or non-traditional student living learning community, or have a parking garage that commuter students don't have to worry about getting tickets or adding 2 hours to their commute because they're parking and writing. I mean, these are the kind of things that we're hearing from students. Or, I had a student tell me, yeah, the tour of campus that shows about the history of these historic buildings, like that's great, but I need to know where the vending machines are and where the bathrooms are, and like, how do I navigate? So I'm like, in my mind, I imagine we need a transfer student tour of campus that talks about like what do transfer students really, really need to know about how to navigate this campus. And I would love the resources of this whole university to get behind those of us who are doing this work to make that a reality. So that's the kind of the things that I'm seeing and the issues that really your talk brought up for me. Thank you so much.
So the last part of your comment is all about flipping the script of truly student-centered relationship building. That example of the vending machine, and in every way, there's a great sign. I think it's in the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana Arts Complex. This was told to me anyway. It's apocryphal. Over the theater, it says, "Come as you are, go away changed." That to me is, and another way of saying that is, we talk a lot about college-ready students, but what we need to have are student-ready colleges. And that the way that the capillary practices, including tours in which that gets made. The last thing I want to say is I'm really interested in this idea of how change happens in higher ed. I don't think we actually understand why the GI Bill was such a great success, because there has been as much of a massive entry into post-secondary institutions in the last 20 years, and as I've described, they've not totally failed, but they've been inadequate. So we need to learn from the moment of the GI Bill. But I think one of the things we can learn from the moment of the high impact practices, this moment kind of between like 1985 and 2000, when it's really interesting, all of those practices that are demonstrably better at engaging students were kind of invented and disseminated all in the same moment. And they partly in response to these crises that I've been describing, but also because they engaged in a kind of associational, sort of movement-like, social movement-like practice in which the distributed geography of higher ed created links, not usually at the level of institutional leaders, not at Mark Schlissel's level, but sort of at my level and yours, that assembled people, that created consortia, people met annually and iteratively and tested practices across all of those 10 or 11 practices. And over the course of a decade, they both improved them and institutionalized them to a greater or lesser extent, because everyone went back and said to their Mark Schlissels, we need to do this, and let me invite this person from elsewhere in the network who will legitimize what we're talking about and report this research. I actually think that practice of networked collaboration is kind of a deep resource of higher ed. We all know it from disciplinary conferences, but these are all examples that cut across disciplinary professionalism and are more insurgent. That's what often creates the critical mass that you're talking about. If you're only thinking of critical mass on my campus, then you're shooting yourself in the foot, because you actually have a range of relationships and creative connections across this networked landscape.
Let's thank David again for sharing his time.